There is a comparison that the people of the American Southwest rarely make out loud, a comparison between two great cities of the interior West that reveals in the starkest possible terms how unequally the coming water crisis will fall. The two cities are Denver and Albuquerque, and on the surface they seem to belong to the same story. Two growing metropolises in the high dry country of the Mountain West, both of them dependent on scarce water in a warming world. Both of them facing the same long drought that grips the entire region. But if you actually run the numbers, if you look honestly at where each city sits in the great plumbing of the West's rivers, at the seniority of its water rights, at the depth of its financial resources, and at the obligations that bind it, a brutal truth emerges. Denver is positioned to survive the coming water crisis, to adapt and endure even as the drought deepens. Albuquerque is not. And the difference between them is written in a piece of arithmetic that almost no one runs out loud, the cold math of the Rio Grande and the watersheds of the West. A math that determines which cities will make it through the coming decades of scarcity and which will face an existential reckoning. This is the story of that very math, of why Denver will likely survive and Albuquerque faces a far harder fate, and of what the comparison reveals about the deep inequalities of water in the American West. To understand the difference between the two cities, you first have to understand where each of them sits in the great architecture of the West's water. Because in the world of water, position is everything, and the two cities occupy profoundly different positions. Denver sits high in the mountains of Colorado, near the very top of the watersheds, close to the sources where the snow falls and the rivers are born. It draws its water from the high country, from the snowmelt of the Rocky Mountains, capturing the water near its source before it flows away to the lower lands. This position near the top of the watershed is a position of enormous advantage because it means Denver takes its water first, before the users downstream, drawing from the rivers when they are full and fresh and abundant, near the very point where the water enters the system. To sit at the top of the watershed is to sit at the head of the table, taking the water before anyone else has a chance to claim it, and Denver, perched high in the Colorado mountains, occupies exactly that enviable position. Albuquerque, by contrast, sits far down the Rio Grande, in the middle of the river's long journey through the desert of New Mexico, hundreds of miles from the high country where the water originates. The Rio Grande rises in the mountains of southern Colorado and flows down through New Mexico, past Albuquerque, and on toward Texas and the border with Mexico. And Albuquerque sits in the middle of this journey, drawing its water from a river that has already flowed a long way and has already been drawn upon by the users upstream. To sit in the middle of the river, downstream of the sources, is to sit in a position of vulnerability, taking the water after others have taken theirs, dependent on what flows down from above, exposed to the reductions that come when the upstream users take their share and the river runs low. Albuquerque's position on the middle Rio Grande is fundamentally weaker than Denver's position near the top of the watershed, and this difference in position is the first and most basic element of the math that separates the fates of the two cities. But position is only the beginning, because layered on top of the geography is the intricate system of water rights and legal obligations that governs who gets the water and who must give it up. And here too, the math favors Denver and burdens Albuquerque. In the American West, water is governed by a system of rights based on seniority, in which those who claim the water first hold the strongest claims, and when the water runs short, the junior users are cut before the senior ones. Denver, as an old and established city near the sources of the water, has secured over its long history a portfolio of water rights, including senior rights and rights to water from multiple sources that give it a strong and diversified claim to the water it needs. It has also, crucially, invested enormously over the decades in the infrastructure to capture and store and move water, building reservoirs and tunnels and diversions that bring water from multiple watersheds to serve the city, so that it does not depend on any single source, but can draw from several, a diversification that provides resilience against the failure of any one of them. Albuquerque, by contrast, is bound by a set of obligations that constrain its access to the Rio Grande in ways that Denver's water is not constrained. The Rio Grande is governed by a compact among the states through which it flows, an agreement that obligates New Mexico to deliver a certain amount of water downstream to Texas, an obligation that does not disappear when the river runs short. This means that Albuquerque and the other users of the Rio Grande in New Mexico cannot simply take all the water that flows past them, but must ensure that enough continues downstream to meet the state's obligation to Texas, a legal duty that constrains the water available to the city. When the river runs low, New Mexico must still deliver its share to Texas, which can force painful reductions on the users within the state, including Albuquerque squeezing the water available to the city in order to meet the downstream obligation. This compact obligation is a burden that Albuquerque bears, and that Denver, sitting atop its own watersheds, largely does not, another element of the math that favors the northern city over the southern one. And there is the matter of the groundwater, the water beneath the ground on which each city can draw as a supplement or a backup to its surface supplies. And here too the comparison is unfavorable to Albuquerque. Albuquerque long depended heavily on the aquifer beneath it, pumping groundwater to sustain the city, until it discovered that the aquifer was far smaller and more quickly depleted than it had believed, that the water beneath the city was being drawn down at an unsustainable rate, threatening to run out. This discovery forced Albuquerque to reduce its reliance on the aquifer and to turn instead to surface water from the Rio Grande, supplemented by water imported through a project that brings water across the mountains from the Colorado River system. But this means that Albuquerque's groundwater is a depleted and stressed resource, not a reliable backup, but a reserve that has already been drawn down and must be husbanded carefully, unable to provide the cushion that a healthy aquifer would offer. Denver, by contrast, sits in a region with its own groundwater resources, and more importantly, with the surface water rights and the infrastructure to draw from multiple mountain watersheds, giving it alternatives that Albuquerque lacks. When you put all of these elements together, the position in the watershed, the seniority and diversity of the water rights, the burden of the compact obligations, the state of the groundwater, and the depth of the financial and infrastructural resources, you arrive at the math that separates the fates of the two cities. Denver sits high in the watersheds, with senior and diversified water rights, with the infrastructure to draw from multiple sources, with the financial resources of a large and wealthy metropolitan area to invest in further resilience, and without the burden of a compact obligation forcing it to send its water downstream. It is positioned, in short, to adapt to the coming scarcity, to weather the drought, to secure its water even as the crisis deepens. Albuquerque sits in the middle of a drying river, dependent on a single stressed watershed supplemented by imported water, bound by an obligation to deliver water downstream to Texas, sitting over a depleted aquifer with fewer alternatives and fewer resources to fall back on. It is positioned, in short, for a far harder struggle, facing a reckoning that Denver, by the accident of its geography and the advantages of its history, may largely escape. It is worth dwelling on the Rio Grande itself, because the river that sustains Albuquerque is in deep trouble, and its decline is central to the math that threatens the city. The Rio Grande is one of the great rivers of the Southwest, but like the Colorado, it has been asked to do far more than it can sustainably provide, drawn upon by cities and farms all along its course, its flow diminished by the demands placed upon it, and by the warming climate that is reducing the snowpack that feeds it. In recent years, the Rio Grande has run dangerously low, in some stretches drying up entirely, its bed reduced to sand where a river once flowed, a shocking sight that reveals just how stressed the river has become. For Albuquerque, which depends on the Rio Grande for a large share of its water, the decline of the river is an existential threat. Because as the river shrinks, the water available to the city shrinks with it, and the obligation to deliver water downstream to Texas becomes ever harder to meet, squeezing the city from both sides. The drying of the Rio Grande is the central fact of Albuquerque's water future, and it is a fact that grows more alarming with each dry year. The imported water that Albuquerque relies upon to supplement the Rio Grande deserves particular attention because it reveals another layer of the city's vulnerability. Albuquerque draws part of its water from a project that brings water across the mountains from the headwaters of the Colorado River system, carried through tunnels and channels to supplement the flow of the Rio Grande. This imported water has been a crucial part of Albuquerque's supply, allowing the city to reduce its reliance on the depleted aquifer and to secure a more sustainable source. But this imported water is itself drawn from the troubled Colorado River system, which is in its own deep crisis, its flows declining and its reservoirs falling. So Albuquerque's imported water, far from providing a secure alternative, ties the city's fate to two struggling river systems at once, the Rio Grande and the Colorado, doubling its exposure to the water crisis of the West. Denver, drawing from the high watersheds near the sources, does not depend on this kind of long-distance imported water in the same precarious way, another element of the asymmetry between the two cities. Now, it is important to inject a note of honesty and nuance into this comparison, because the title's stark declaration that Albuquerque won't survive is a dramatic framing, and the reality, while genuinely alarming, is more complex than a simple prophecy of doom. Albuquerque is not going to vanish, is not going to be abandoned overnight, and the city and the state are not passive in the face of the crisis. Albuquerque has, in fact, been a leader in water conservation, dramatically reducing its per capita water use over the years, recognizing its vulnerability, and taking real steps to address it. The city has worked to diversify its supplies, to use its water more efficiently, to plan for a drier future, and these efforts are genuine and important. The point of the comparison is not that Albuquerque is literally doomed while Denver is invincible, but that the fundamental math of their positions, the geography and the rights and the obligations and the resources, gives Denver a far greater capacity to endure the coming scarcity than Albuquerque possesses. Albuquerque faces a much harder struggle, a much steeper climb, a much greater risk of reaching the limits of what adaptation can achieve, and in that sense it faces a reckoning that Denver may largely escape. The comparison is a way of dramatizing a real and important asymmetry, not a literal prediction that one city will thrive and the other will die. With that nuance established, the deeper truth of the comparison remains, and it is a truth that reaches beyond these two cities to reveal something fundamental about the future of water in the American West. The crisis of water in the West will not fall equally on all places, but will fall according to the math of position and rights and resources, sparing some and burdening others, based on factors that have little to do with need or fairness, and everything to do with the accidents of geography and history. The cities that sit high in the watersheds, with senior rights and diversified supplies and deep resources, will be far better able to endure the scarcity than the cities that sit downstream, dependent on drying rivers, bound by obligations, sitting over depleted aquifers, with fewer alternatives and fewer resources. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of water in the West, a math that determines winners and losers not by justice, but by the cold logic of the watershed and the water rights system. And the comparison between Denver and Albuquerque is a vivid illustration of how unequally the crisis will fall. It is worth understanding, too, why Denver's transmountain diversions give it such a durable edge, because this is one of the least appreciated advantages in the whole comparison. Denver sits on the eastern side of the Continental Divide, in a part of Colorado that is naturally drier than the western slope where much of the state's water falls. And over its long history, the city built an elaborate system to capture water on the wet western side of the mountains and carry it through tunnels beneath the divide to the thirsty cities of the east. This means that Denver does not depend on a single river, but reaches across the mountains to draw from multiple watersheds, gathering water from several sources and blending them into a diversified supply. When one source runs low, the city can lean on the others, a flexibility that provides a powerful cushion against the failure of any single stream. Albuquerque has nothing comparable, dependent as it is on the single artery of the Rio Grande, supplemented by one imported source, both of them drawn from stressed systems. The contrast between a city that reaches across the mountains to gather water from many watersheds and one that depends on a single drying river is one of the sharpest expressions of the math that separates their fates, a difference built up over a century of investment that Albuquerque cannot easily replicate now. The reason this math is one that nobody runs, as the title suggests, is that it is uncomfortable to confront, because it forces a recognition of inequalities and vulnerabilities that are painful to acknowledge. No city wants to hear that it sits on the losing side of the water math, that its position is weak, that its future is imperiled, and so the honest comparison of the fates of different cities is rarely made out loud, avoided in favor of a more comforting vagueness that treats all cities as facing the same manageable challenge. But the math is real, whether or not it is spoken, and the failure to run it to confront honestly the differing fates of different places does a disservice to the cities on the vulnerable side of the equation, which need to understand their position clearly in order to prepare for it. Running the math, uncomfortable as it is the first step toward honest planning, toward the recognition that some places face a far harder struggle than others and must act accordingly, toward the difficult conversations about how the burden of the crisis will be distributed and what can be done to help the most vulnerable. For Albuquerque, running the math honestly would mean confronting the full scale of its vulnerability, the drying of the Rio Grande on which it depends, the burden of its compact obligations, the depletion of its aquifer, the precariousness of its imported water, and the limits of what conservation and adaptation can achieve against these fundamental constraints. It would mean recognizing that the city faces a reckoning that many of its residents may not fully appreciate, a future in which the water that has sustained its growth may no longer be reliably available, in which hard choices about growth and agriculture and the allocation of a shrinking supply can no longer be avoided. This is a difficult truth to confront, but confronting it is essential, because only by understanding the true scale of the challenge can the city and the state hope to prepare for it, to make the investments and the changes and the difficult decisions that might, if anything can, allow Albuquerque to endure. The alternative, to avoid the math and drift toward the crisis unprepared, is far more dangerous, a path that leads to being caught unaware when the water finally runs short. For Denver, the more favorable math should not breed complacency, because even a well-positioned city faces real challenges in a warming world, and the advantages that protect Denver today are not guarantees of permanent security. The drought that grips the West is deepening. The climate is warming, the snowpack that feeds even Denver's high watersheds is threatened, and the demands on the water continue to grow as the region's population expands. Denver's advantages are real, but they are relative, and even the best-positioned city must continue to conserve and adapt and plan, must not assume that its favorable position will protect it forever against a crisis that is intensifying. The comparison with Albuquerque should be, for Denver, not an occasion for complacency, but a reminder of how much its relative security depends on factors it did not create and cannot take for granted, and of the responsibility that comes with sitting on the more favorable side of the water math in a region where so many face a harder fate. So the comparison between Denver and Albuquerque, stark and uncomfortable as it is, reveals a truth that the American West must confront. The truth that the coming water crisis will fall unequally, that the math of position and rights and resources will spare some cities and imperil others. That the future of water in the West is a future of winners and losers determined by factors that have little to do with fairness. Denver, high in its watersheds, with senior rights and diversified supplies and deep resources, is positioned to survive and adapt. Albuquerque, downstream on a drying river, bound by obligations, sitting over a depleted aquifer, faces a far harder reckoning, a struggle that will test the limits of what adaptation can achieve. The math that separates their fates is a math that nobody runs out loud because it is painful to confront, but it is a math that is real and that will assert itself as the crisis deepens, whether or not anyone acknowledges it. And the lesson of that math for the entire West is that the crisis of water will not be shared equally, that some places will endure and others will struggle, and that the honest recognition of this uncomfortable truth is the first step toward preparing for a future in which the water that made the modern West possible can no longer be taken for granted by anyone. In the end, the story of Denver and Albuquerque is the story of the West's reckoning with its water, a reckoning that will fall differently on different places according to the cold arithmetic of the watersheds, and the rights and the resources. It is a story that should be told honestly, with all its uncomfortable inequalities laid bare, because only by running the math that nobody runs, by confronting the differing fates of different cities, can the West hope to prepare for the crisis that is coming. Denver will most likely survive, adapting and enduring on the strength of its favorable position. Albuquerque faces a far harder struggle, a reckoning that will demand everything the city can muster and may still test the limits of its survival. And the difference between them, written in the math of the Rio Grande and the watersheds of the West, is a warning to every city in the region to understand its own position clearly, to run its own math honestly, and to prepare, while there is still time, for the unequal and unforgiving